This is the Gulf of Maine. There are birds out here you've never seen, but you're about to. We're looking at the Gulf of Maine from Acadia National Park. This is the way most tourists see it. And most tourists don't know what they're missing. Birds and sea mammals come from all over this side of the world to come into the Gulf of Maine for reasons that are a little mysterious. We'll bump into some whales, some porpoises, dolphins, seals, but it's the birds we're after. Birds that are coming in here because of what the Gulf of Maine is. Pelagic seabirds that are normally found in the open ocean, but are pretty reachable right here. Now, I'm making this invitation to you in the dead of winter. It was 10 below zero when I woke up this morning. It's now a balmy 17 degrees. You can tell it's winter because purple sandpipers, I love these guys. So there are birds here that come all the way up from the Antarctic, all the way down from the Arctic, all the way over from Europe, just to feast in the Gulf of Maine. I'm inviting you to come this summer and take a look, and I'll show you right now how to plan it. What we're really after is pelagic birds, birds of the open ocean. Out there, it's like the Serengeti. There are 4 big reasons why. Number 1, 335 million years ago, the continents collided to form one big continent. Maine was joined to Morocco at that time. Then, 250 million years ago, they broke apart again. All of that created a shoreline that looks like this. It's a real mess. It's like that under the surface, too. The ocean floor is really rough with lots of ridges and ledges. Number 2, what the continental collision didn't do, the Ice Age did, smashing up Maine and making a coastline that in many places along the Gulf looks like this. The Ice Age carried some of that debris 300 miles out into the Gulf and just dumped it into 2 big shallow banks with the Northeast Channel running through it. That created essentially a cold water bathtub with a spigot. And it's cold because the Labrador Current comes down from the north and flows through that channel into the Gulf of Maine. Meanwhile, the warm waters of the Gulf Stream pass by Maine altogether and head over to Europe to warm up that continent. Cold water holds more oxygen. More oxygen nourishes sea life. The more plankton, the more food there is higher up the food chain. It's a banquet table out there, and everybody knows it. Number 4, Maine has the highest tides in the United States outside of Alaska. All that water rushes into the Gulf of Maine. It squeezes up into the Bay of Fundy, so the tides get up to the highest tides in the world, up to the top of the bay, and all that water flows over these ridges and ledges and gets pushed up, bringing the food to where the whales and seabirds can reach it more easily. And they know it. All right, what's out there? Let's ID some birds. And we'll start with the gulls, and we'll go through that quickly because, gulls. Then we'll move on to the puffins, the shearwaters, the Jaegers. Now, that's all in the open ocean. There's also a nesting island out here for puffins and other birds, and at the end we'll sort of hit some of those too, just so you know what to do when you get into the Gulf of Maine. As far as gulls go, most of them are herring gulls. Great blackback gulls are pretty common too, and they especially seem to like the deep ocean, so expect them when you get out there. The blackback and big size is obvious on them. Immature herring gulls are brownish. Immature blackback gulls are a mottled charcoal gray. Ring-billed gulls are the 3rd most common out here, but in early summer, most of them are in freshwater up in northern Maine lakes and up in Canada. And then later on in season, post-breeding, they'll start to come down here in bigger numbers and hang out in the ocean side and in McDonald's parking lots. Ring-billed gulls are smaller than the other 2, but a little bit bigger than the laughing gull, which is the 4th most common gull we're going to see out here. Laughing gulls have the black heads, so that helps most of the summer. They will lose it towards autumn, but there's still a dark smudge in the face behind the eye, and the bill has a downward curve that is apparent at the right viewing angle, even from a distance. And besides the smaller size, young laughing gulls just look darker brown than the other immature gulls, and the top of the wing is quite dark, darker than any other gull out there. Really, it's size and dark. That's your clue for laughing gull on a quick flyby. Now, these 4 gulls are pretty readily seen from land. Nobody gets too excited about them. There are 3 that are a little less common on land, and people do get more excited about them. Black-legged kittiwakes are out here. They nest along the coast of New Brunswick, and in the northern half of the Gulf, they will filter down later in summer. Southern half of the Gulf of Maine, you might not see them quite so much. Black-legged kittiwake is about the size of a ring-billed gull, and the black inky wingtips are diagnostic. But what will really tip you off is their distinctive flight style. They have a fairly stiff, shallow wing beat that's pretty obvious, especially with those black wingtips. Adults in the fall get a little neck collar. And the first-year immatures rock a back wing and tail pattern that might confuse anyone who's not watching this. Now, if you really want to see them, there's plenty in the Head Harbor Passage, which separates the U.S. from Canada along Campobello Island. Bonaparte's gulls. They nest all over northern Canada on freshwater bodies, and they're the only gull species that nest in trees. In breeding plumage, they're black-headed like a bunch of other gulls, but they're one of the smallest. They tend to stay close to shore, but you catch them out in the open ocean now and then. Thousands collect in Head Harbor Passage later in summer. Thousands. Adults have the black head, but what I really want you to notice is the two-tone top wing. The leading edge is gleaming white, sharply going gray to the back. The same pattern is obvious when they go into winter plumage, keeping the wing pattern but replacing the black head with just an ear spot. Immature gulls have the black ear spot, but the top of the wing is marked with what kind of looks like an inverted W as it's flying by. But pay attention to that two-tone wing pattern because no other black-headed gull has that. One rare gull out here in the Gulf of Maine is becoming less rare. The lesser black-backed gull nests all across Europe and over to Iceland and has just recently moved into Greenland. It's probably those birds that are starting to winter along the entire North American East Coast. They do look a lot like great black-backed gulls, but they're smaller, only the size of a herring gull. The blackback is not quite as black, more slate-colored, and they have bright yellow legs. Now, there are some other field marks that are noticeable close up, but on a bouncing boat, as a bird's flying by, you're not close up. One good tern deserves another, but really there's only 2 terns out here you have to be concerned about out in the Gulf of Maine. That's common and Arctic. Now, there are some roseate terns, but there's just a few of them, and they're around a couple of nesting islands, and you almost never see them out to sea. So the ones we're after, common and Arctic. Common and Arctic terns actually nest together on open scrapes and rocks, and they forage together, so you get them in mixed flocks. They can be very hard to separate. Close up, the common tern has a red bill with a black tip. The Arctic tern's bill is totally red, but at a distance, spotting that field mark in a flying bird from a bouncing boat is challenging. Flight style is the easiest. Arctic terns have a smaller head and a longer tail, which makes them look more streamlined in flight. Their wing beats are distinctively more shallow than the common tern. Supposedly, when seen from below, the wings of the Arctic tern appear translucent. Good luck with that one. Never works for me. Sun's never in the right angle. We do get Caspian terns moving through, so if you see a big tern, that's it. Royal terns do get into Maine, but really they're not common at all. Boy, that's how you know you're in a national park. This deer is looking for a handout. There are 4 members of the Alcid family, either in nesting colonies offshore or, later on in summer, out in the Gulf. Atlantic puffins are the birds most people want to see. Razorbills are also out here. Common murres are also out here. Black guillemots are everywhere, though they tend to stay closer to land. Thick-billed murres and dovekies do get into the Gulf of Maine, but they're coming from quite far north and don't arrive till winter. By then, all the tour boats are out of the water. We'll talk about the puffins a little more when we talk about the breeding islands later on, but later in summer, a lot of them just head right out in the Gulf. All Alcids have short wings, so they have to flap them as fast as a bumblebee to stay aloft. That's your first clue. Shape is your second clue. Murres and razorbills are bigger than puffins and fly like torpedoes, straight and level. Razorbills have a thick bill visible at a distance. Common murres have a thin, pointed bill. Black guillemots also have a thin, pointed bill, but they're the only Alcid out here with a black belly, and the wing patches are a dead giveaway. Guillemots do get out in deep water, but their favorite food is generally close to shore, so mostly you are going to see them close to land, and you can see them at the mainland pretty easily much of the time. Atlantic puffins lose the big colorful bill in winter, but that change happens after they leave the Gulf. Otherwise, the plumage doesn't change. Immature puffin bills are small. Razorbills and murres do change plumage, going whiter underneath for the winter. Black guillemots make the biggest change, going all mottled gray in winter, and that color is how the youngsters start out life. Then there are the pelagic birds, the birds of the open ocean, the birds that would rather sit on water and only sit on land when it's time to lay an egg. Some of them are tube noses, birds that have evolved a tube in the top of the bill that secretes all the salt that they pick up in their saltwater environment. Storm-petrels are small tube noses, and we have 2 of them out here in the Gulf of Maine. Wilson storm-petrels are abundant offshore. These are coming into the Gulf from their nesting islands off Argentina and Antarctica. Both storm-petrels, Wilsons and leeches, have white butt patches, but here's how you tell them apart. Wilson storm-petrels fly like swallows, acrobatic and zigzagging as needed. They often pitty-pat along the surface, which is where the name petrel came from. It reminded 17th century English explorers of St. Peter walking on water. When you see one offshore, expect many more. There's never just one. Also, when the tide is slack, they're often just sitting on the surface, waiting for the tide to turn and get the food moving again. The other storm petrel out here is the leech's storm petrel, and these actually do nest on offshore islands here. In fact, there's thousands on these islands right out here. But leech's storm petrels are nocturnal. They go out to sea in the cover of darkness, gather a lot of food, and then bring it back to the youngsters. And we don't usually see them during breeding season. Post-breeding, we will start to see a few of them out here in the Gulf. They also have a very different flight style. If a Wilson's is like a swallow, the leech's is like a nighthawk, bounding and swooping on longer wings. If you get a good enough look at the Wilson storm petrel, you'll see the tail is squared off. On a leech's storm petrel, the tail is forked. But really, it's the flight style, swallow versus nighthawk. Shearwaters and fulmars are the other tube noses out here. Fulmars come in late after most tourists have gone home. We'll get to them in a moment. 4 shearwaters get into the Gulf of Maine in summer, coming from all over the Western Hemisphere. Characteristically, shearwaters have a stiff, shallow wing beat. They often fly close to the waves, sometimes seeming to shear the water while picking food off the surface. Great shearwaters are the most numerous and dependable. They nest in a remote island group between South America and South Africa called Tristan da Cunha. Then they come up here. They're larger than most shearwaters and not very worried about boats. They can be very close. Look for a brownish-gray bird with a white collar and a dark cap. It's white underneath, and there's usually a white band visible at the base of the tail. Some shearwaters are more acrobatic than others. The great shearwaters tend to fly with the same basic enthusiasm as the gulls, so you'll pick them out by their stiff, shallow wing beats and their tendency to fly right close to the surface of the water. Sooty shearwaters are the second most common shearwater out here. They're coming up from nesting islands off Argentina and off the Antarctica. There's another colony over near New Zealand, but those tend to go up the Pacific coast. Look for a uniformly dark shearwater, although with a dim silvery tone to the underwings. I don't know, they've been a little more sporadic in recent years, but they're still out here somewhere. Manx shearwaters are the smallest out here. They're also a North Atlantic breeder. They breed mostly over around Europe, but they do occasionally try to breed over here. Matinicus Rock is one place they keep trying. 3 things to note: smaller size and somewhat shorter wings. Black on top, not gray or sooty, and white on the bottom. And they are speedy, maybe twice the speed of other shearwaters out here. Look at this Manx shearwater just pull away from this great shearwater. Cory shearwater is the largest, slowest shearwater out here. They nest off the coast of Africa and southern Europe and in the Mediterranean. So it prefers warmer water than we're used to over here. But unfortunately, as the Gulf warms up, they're starting to visit more often. Look for the large size The slow flight, tending to coast a little longer than other shearwaters do. They're beige in color. They've got a bright yellow bill you can't miss. So that's it. 4 species of shearwater in the Gulf of Maine, all with those shallow, stiff wing beats, but each one with its own special flight style. Then throw northern fulmars into the mix. No tube-nosed nests farther north than these guys. In eastern North America, a few nest in Newfoundland and Labrador, but most nest in the Arctic. After nesting, they spend most of their lives in the open ocean, but some of those do come down here later on in summer. They arrive late, just some of the other tube-nosers are leaving. They have the same stiff, shallow flight style of the shearwaters, accented by fast glides. With a shorter tail, they look squatter than the shearwaters. They come in light and dark color morphs, and these morphs have no problem congregating with each other. From a distance, they look kind of like a chunky gull. Northern gannets are the largest birds out here, with a wingspan over 7 feet. They nest in just 2 huge colonies, one up in Newfoundland at Cape St. Mary, and the other is Gaspé Peninsula, Bonaventure Island in Quebec. There's usually no problem identifying these guys, except that it takes them 3 to 4 years to reach breeding age, and the majority of the birds out in the Gulf are immature. The younger they are, the darker they are. Adult birds are gleaming white with big black wingtips. Gannets are easy. Nothing else out here is this big and obvious, especially when they're feeding plunge diving like a lawn dart from up to 100 feet in the air. The smallest birds out here are Phalaropes. They're small shorebirds that have adapted to a life at sea. They're like flying ping pong balls out here. There are 3 Phalarope species in North America, but one of them is seldom found at sea. Wilson's is not out here. The other 2 are red-necked and red Phalaropes. The ones we mostly see are red-necked Phalaropes out here, but there are a lot of red Phalaropes and often mixed in with them. The name is misleading because when we see them in the fall, the red's mostly gone. They're mostly white and gray. It's helpful when they're in mixed flocks, which they do a lot. The red Phalaropes are slightly larger than the red-necked and overall a brighter white. The red Phalaropes also have a gray back, whereas the back of a red-necked Phalarope is black streaked and mottled. But that's hard to see at a distance, so quick tip, if it looks a little brighter white, maybe a little bit bigger, it's a red Phalarope. Otherwise, if it's darker, it's a red-necked Phalarope. One important tip, they love sitting in those little floating patches of seaweed out in the ocean. Whenever I go through one of those patches at sea, I look into every one of them looking for those little ping pong balls. Now it gets hard. Jaegers and skuas. There are 3 species of Jaeger that are possible out here and 2 species of skua. They're all kleptoparasites, which means that they're robbing food from all the other birds out here. So your first step in making an identification is it a Jaeger or a skua? Size matters. Skuas are bigger than Jaegers, but actually size is deceptive. The skuas are actually only about the size of herring gulls, but they're so brawny and powerful that they look bigger than they are. All the skuas and Jaegers have white flashes in the wings. It's a little brighter in the skuas, and that usually is what's going to catch your eye. If you see one of these guys chasing a gull to steal its food, it's most likely to be a Pomeranian Jaeger. It's the most common out here and also the biggest of the 3 Jaegers. Because of its brawniness, it looks big, but really it's only about the size of a ring-billed gull. Parasitic Jaegers are a little bit smaller. Long-tailed Jaegers are a little smaller than that. But if they're alone, it's really hard to judge the size, so what you're going to look for is that barrel chest, because if it's really a bulky barrel chest, it's most likely a Pomeranian Jaeger. By the way, Jaeger is a German word for hunter. Now let's do some comparisons. Pomeranians tend to have a brighter wing flash than parasitic. But that's not helpful if you have only a limited experience with Jaegers, because how do you calibrate how bright it is? Flight style is a little bit different. Pomeranians more powerful, more straight, direct. Parasitic Jaegers, a little more acrobatic. Long-tailed Jaegers, definitely more acrobatic, especially when you can see the long-tail feathers, and they are just much more buoyant in the air. But again, if you're not familiar with any of them, how can you calibrate that? The tail is a clue for all 3 Jaegers. Spoon-shaped on the Pomeranian, fork-shaped on the parasitic, and long in the long-tail. But you can't trust it. All 3 species are Arctic breeders. All are down here after they finish breeding, and they may be molting. those long tail feathers you're looking for might not even be there. To make matters worse, Jaegers come in light and dark color morphs, like this dark Pomeranian Jaeger. And immatures can come in a range of colors, so nope. What you have to go by is that barrel chest. 3/4 of your attention when you see a Jaeger should be to look at what that chest area looks like. If below the neck it looks like it swallowed a grapefruit, that's probably a Pomeranian Jaeger. And good luck with that skinny, acrobatic long-tail Jaeger. I've seen just a handful in Alaska and only one in the Gulf of Maine. And that was a lousy video. Skuas, bigger, brawnier, white wing flashes that you can't miss. Problem is, size and white wing flash matches both skuas. South Polar and Great Skua both have it. This is the best I can do to figure out which is which. Great skuas tend to be a mottled gray. South Polar skuas tend to be a more uniformly dark chocolate without much mottling. But you got to be pretty close to see the plumage difference. And besides, one of them is just going into breeding season, one is just coming out. Their plumages can be a mess. I hope your luck is better than mine. Listen, if you have to identify a skua at sea, make your best guess and shout it out with confidence, because probably nobody's going to challenge you. And in this case, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. If you can't take one but you see a photographer, get an email address. That's a specific look at all the birds we might see out here in the Gulf of Maine when you come later on this summer. Now, follow me. We're going to talk about how to get out there. To see them, you probably want to get on a whale watch boat. Now, there are famous ledges and ridges offshore where the whales and birds tend to gather. Some of those come off of Mount Desert Island, where Acadia National Park is. Bar Harbor Whale Watch is your best bet coming out to hit those. Southern Maine is Jeffrey's Ledge, where you go out of Booth Bay Harbor or Kennebunkport. You get a whale watch boat, you have a pretty good chance of these pelagic species. Most of these birds are coming from somewhere else, often spending our summer here while it's winter there. You can expect to see more pelagic birds later in summer. Coincidentally, early summer is a better time to visit the nesting islands where the Atlantic puffins and their relatives are. Most nesting birds are back in their islands in late April before the tour boats even start going out. They're already waiting for you when you get in a boat and go out to see them. There are 5 nesting islands for Atlantic puffins off the coast of Maine. Eastern Egg Rock is the southernmost, with tour boats visiting from Booth Bay Harbor, New Harbor, and Port Clyde. Next is Botanicus Rock, but that's so far out that no tour boat currently goes there. The middle island is Seal Island. That's reachable from Stonington by the Idaho Ferry. They usually go out 2 times a week. Petite Manan is the next one up. It's north of Acadia National Park. Boats go out there from several different locations, including Bar Harbor, including Millbridge, and in between, Steuben. Machias Seal Island is northernmost. It's reachable from Cutler, but there's only one tour boat that goes out there. It's the only island where passengers are allowed to land, so it's so popular it usually books up the moment tickets go on sale, as early as January. By the end of July, a lot of nestlings have fledged and the birds begin to leave. Expect razorbills to depart about the end of July. Puffins will start to wander off by mid-August, about the same time terns begin to depart. The Gulf of Maine is big. In fact, it's too big for most boats to hit Puffin Islands and go chase the pelagic species. Usually, you're going to have to choose which tour you're doing, or maybe you don't. Just do both. So that's it, your invitation to come this summer or any summer to experience what it's really like out there in the Gulf of Maine.
Oh, look at that, look at that. Oh, oh, beautiful. It goes down, it went right there. Oh, look at that.